Well, welcome everyone. My name is Cindy Miles, and I'm the president and CEO of the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber. And I'm excited to present to you today about ED and board succession planning. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the slides that I have for today. I love talking about this topic simply because there are a lot of nonprofit organizations that are neither prepared with a succession plan for their executive director nor a succession plan for their board of directors. And so I think it's important to plan for that time when your board chair or your executive director, in whatever case, happen to leave the organization. And it's especially important if for some reason either one of these positions leaves the organization suddenly. It's important to have something in place. So let's move right on into talking about succession planning. So what is succession planning? Well, here's a few things that I have bullet points on this PowerPoint. So it is an insurance policy for your organization. It is a way to know, or is a plan for knowing how the organization is going to move forward and to ensure that it's going to continue to move forward, even when either the board chair or the executive director, and certainly the executive director, leaves the organization. So it is that insurance policy to make sure that you'll continue to operate in the way that you should. It is leadership transition. So whether that, again, is the executive, whether it's a board member, whether it's the board chair, whether it's some sort of a senior staff, it is a transition of some sort of leadership that you need to be prepared to transition to the next person in. It should be a component of your strategic plan and potentially updated annually. So lots of things change in a year, and certainly in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of changes occur with the pandemic and all. So reviewing that succession plan on an annual basis, and that can be something that your governance committee does and should be assigned to your governance committee to make sure that that happens on an annual basis. And you can update different things within the succession plan, which we'll talk about later, some of those components of the succession plan. It does put certain systems in place that are there to prepare you to make those transitions, whether it's just a list of passwords or where to find important documents or other things. You might find as you go through the succession planning process that you don't have all the things in place that you think you do. And then it is an opportunity to provide cross training within your organization and let other people on the board find out about the role of the board chair and what they actually do and learn more about that, as well as taking on that leadership position. And it's an opportunity for other people within the organization to really learn a little bit more about what the executive does, where to find certain documents, how to perform certain duties within the organization. And it is an opportunity for you to really iron out those details of where everything's at. It is amazing, especially with an executive director and myself functioning in that role as the executive, the type of tribal knowledge that an executive may have that nobody else thinks to ask about because that person just does that. So certainly this is an opportunity to relay what those details are. So as I mentioned, one of the things about the succession planning is really planning for successful transitions for the organization. And some of those transitions are related to board leadership and engagement. So how does the board become engaged within the organization, and what does board leadership look like? What is it going to look like in the future? Are there other people that are willing to step up? Certainly that healthy closure with a departing executive. So you never want to transition an executive out and have them leave upset or whatever. You want to be able to make sure that you leave on good terms. It's dangerous for that not to happen, because certainly the executive has the opportunity to go out and talk negatively about the organization or do other things that could potentially hurt the brand image. Same thing happens with the board chair. Even if the board chair rolls off, decides to leave early, whatever that is, that you need to make sure there's a healthy closure there. It is an opportunity to do a strategic review and create a candidate profile, so you have an idea of what you had in the past, what was the role of that executive, what was the role of the board member, and should it remain the same? Should it be different? What do you want in potential candidates for the future? And I know that I do some other sessions where I talk about the gap analysis for the board. So this is an opportunity to look at what are the skills that haven't been in place? What are the skills, strengths, and experience? What are those skills, strengths, and experience that you need in place for the future? It's certainly an opportunity when you plan a successful transition to engage the staff. And I truly believe, especially when you're transitioning an executive out of their role, that you need to have some sort of staff engagement, because as the board hires a new executive, it's important that that new executive kind of fits in with the culture of the organization. As long as it's a good culture, you want somebody that can work well with the existing staff. Otherwise, you find yourself potentially having lots and lots of turnover within the organization and lots of transitions at one time. It is an opportunity to attract qualified candidates. So you've got to go through that process of not only have you identified what you want in a candidate, but you've got to figure out how you're going to attract qualified candidates. And I know in this day and age, that can be a real challenge, as the job market is really tight right now. We're all struggling with finding qualified candidates. Then you've got to go through the process of thoroughly screening those candidates for the organization. And again, if you've done the work well of creating that candidate profile and identifying what it is that you need from a candidate, it makes it a lot easier to do that candidate screening. And you really need to think about, as you do the candidate screening, what's the process going to be like for that, and who's going to be engaged in that process. So I see some organizations will bring together 7 or 8 people. That's a lot to be involved in that process. Sometimes you want to pick just a few people from your board and maybe some stakeholders or other people within the community that might be working with that executive a lot. So it's important to identify how you're going to thoroughly screen the potential candidates. And then you've got to pay attention to the way you launch the new executive, the way you communicate that, not only internally, but externally to the stakeholders, to the people that the organization serves, to the donors, to the other organizations that your organization might be really involved with. So it's important to make sure that you think through all of those things and how you're going to communicate specifically the launch of a new executive. So why should you do succession planning? Well, I think some of the reasons that I've already talked about, like what is succession planning, certainly gives you some idea of why you should do it. Certainly you don't want to catch yourself in a position where an executive suddenly walks away and you don't have any idea who's going to do what or how the organization is going to function. But interestingly enough, a recent survey of Kansas nonprofits found that nearly 80% lacked any succession plan. So 80%, that's a lot of organizations running around there without a succession plan. And considering we have about, well, a little more than 17,000 nonprofit organizations in the state of Kansas, and most of those are small to medium sized nonprofit organizations, so they don't have huge amounts of staff. That if you don't have a succession plan, you could really be at a crisis for how your organization is going to continue to run. It is a way of creating, as I mentioned earlier, organizational sustainability. So again, making sure that the organization is going to continue to operate in the way that it has, or that it's going to have opportunities to operate better, but certainly to make sure that the organization is going to be able to continue to sustain their operations, sustain their funding specifically, because we all know funding is one of the most important things for a nonprofit organization. It is an opportunity to grow. It's an opportunity to look at not only where the gaps are with the skills and strengths and experience of the organization, but where those opportunities are for growth, and making sure that the person that you bring on board as the new executive actually has the skills to take the organization to the next level. I know one of the organizations that I worked with in the past, I served on the board. I was been involved in hiring a couple of executive directors with different organizations over the years. But this particular organization, they had a lady as an executive director for many years. She was a fantastic lady. She had done great things to the organization. She'd grown the organization, expanded the organization, and she had a certain skill set for that organization. But when we were hiring a new executive after she retired, we needed to figure out for the organization what was next. I know that one of their divisions was in a building that was deteriorating, and sure, it was an ideal location. But we needed to think about that. We needed to think about how to grow the donor database. We needed to think about what else did we want to add in the future. So we needed to identify the skills related to that, so we could take advantage of the opportunity to grow the organization. It is an opportunity to look at best practice. What community impact that the organization has, what community impact, do you have now? What community impact do you want in the future? So it's an opportunity to look at that. And then certainly an opportunity for leadership and talent development, not only, on your board, as you want to look at that for succession planning and who's going to be the up and coming leadership on the board, and how are you going to develop your board members so somebody's prepared for that. But the same with the executive. It's an opportunity not only for the executive to develop more talent or leadership skills, but certainly internally, how do you develop the people that are currently employed by the organization, so they're ready to move up in the future. So certainly building leaders equals a quality team. And, we all have to build leadership within our organizations in order to have more effective employees, maintain happy employees, certainly. So leaders do have a lot to do with the quality of a team overall. If you have a team that's all followers, or if you have a team that's all leaders, you don't have people that have different type of qualifications, skills, strengths, and experience, then you really find yourself within a bind. So you need to make sure that you have good leaders and different levels of leaders, I guess. You've got to have those leaders and followers. And as I said there, an organization or board without experienced leadership is often without direction. So I know that for myself, I'm a visionary. It's important for me to think about the big vision and where we're going. But I also need to be balanced out with people that know how to do detail stuff, and people that have other skills, strengths, and experience that I don't have. And it's important for me to recognize what my strengths are, what my leadership qualities are, and what they aren't, and certainly identify other people that can do those things that I certainly know I don't do well. So implications for nonprofits. Sorry, I struggled a bit with that word. A lot of transition is occurring. So I know from where I sit that I certainly watch a lot of transition amongst board members, amongst board chairs, certainly amongst executive directors, all over the place. We have an aging population of executive directors that are choosing to retire, and we have to identify as nonprofit organizations how we're going to deal with the transitions that have come or coming in the future, coming in the near future. We've got to figure out how to deal with that, because it is going on. I see movement all the time amongst nonprofit organizations, executives moving from one place to the next, development directors moving from one place to the next. So I always see that transition. It's occurring on an ongoing basis. Most view transition as a search. And then the major cause of failure is that systems are not in place. So they have not prepared for those transitions. They haven't put the things in place. It does cause the organizations to not operate as effectively as they should, or it does, they run into challenges, I guess. And of course, board engagement is crucial, certainly in the transition of an executive. You've got to have the board engaged with identifying what happens next. So let's talk a little bit about being ready for succession. We're going to go through a little quiz here, and I'm going to ask you some questions. So we've got, really the point is to identify whether or not, someone could easily succeed you, or whether you're the board chair, whether you're the executive, whether you serve on some other role within the organization. So it's important for you to know, how easily somebody could succeed you. And I would be curious about what your thoughts are about that. It is something that you should really think about. Could somebody just step in and do your job if there was no preparation whatsoever? And then what would be the greatest concerns if suddenly the executive walked out the door? Good morning, Meredith. Can you hear me? Good morning. I am just in the middle of talking about organizational readiness and how prepared are you. So if you would engage with me for a moment. I have a couple of questions up here on the slide. One is, do you believe that someone could easily succeed you in the position that you're in right now? Is there somebody ready? Meredith, can you hear me?
Okay, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen now.
So I was just asking, do you believe that someone could easily succeed you in your role that you're in? And I don't know what role you're in. Maybe you want to share that with me.
Oh, sure. I'm executive director, and the reason that this was of interest to me is because I know that we are starting up a capital campaign, and I know that when that is finished a few years from now, 4 years from now, I'm ready to be finished. So
I understand that.
yeah.
So what do you think about your question of whether somebody could easily succeed you right now?
I think that there is some work on my end that I need to do with my board as well as my staff to get that ironed out.
Yep, certainly. So the other question is, because we're getting ready to go into a little test about organizational preparedness, but what would be your greatest concern if you like walked out the door one day? What would be the greatest concern? You think you're prepared, somebody could just step in and take over your role and never miss a beat?
Yes, but not with all of the grace that I would hope somebody could.
Yes, that makes sense. All right. And I have recorded this session. I'm recording this session, so whatever you didn't get in on the beginning will be available for you, okay?
Okay.
All
Hang on,
right.
just
So determine succession readiness really has to look at having a solid organization and looking at the characteristics of a solid organization, making sure that you've got the right conditions in place, that everything's ready and lined up, so when that transition happens, when you would leave in the future, that everybody is aware of what their role is, what they should be doing, what they should be picking up on during that transition. And certainly not only those things, what they pick up in the interim, but certainly what that new executive would need to know as they transition into the new role. This test that we'll do will help you determine which elements are lacking in your current operations, what things that you need to put in place that maybe you don't have in place, or that you haven't thought about putting in place in case or when that time comes, when you decide to leave. It really helps you create a capacity building plan and identifies, what activities and what different things do you all need to create in order to fill any gaps that might exist, and helps you prepare for leadership transitions, whether they're leadership transitions that happen because somebody decides that they're done and they get up and walk out, or whether it's leadership transitions that, are planned leadership transitions. So let's go through this readiness checklist. So I'm going to go through each item and I'm going to let you rate your organization. Hopefully you have a pen or something handy. And I want you to put a 2 if it's in place, a 1 if this is partially in place, or a 0 if it's not in place at all. So let's get started. A current strategic plan.
okay. In place.
Okay. A current annual operations plan.
And define what an operations plan is.
It is a plan that just talks about how your operations really occur, from like looking at a timeline for your organization, what happens when, when an event is held, when the 990s filed, those different types of things tied to operations of the organization.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
And then an operational manual, which kind of outlines that operations plan. Financial systems and policies.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Employee policies and procedures.
Okay. It's employee manual. Okay.
financial reserves.
So financially, some reserves in the fund.
Yes, and a good idea to think about is maybe you've got at least 6 months financial reserves.
Yeah, okay, yes, okay,
So stakeholder relationship. So do you have that written down? Are other people aware of the important stakeholder relationships?
okay, yes, okay,
You have a list of key contacts and constituent list and databases.
yes. Yeah, we have a donor management system.
Okay, and so donor records, and are they in a database? That's
Uh-huh.
good. You're doing well so far. Does your senior leadership team work together? Are they cross-trained and or could they manage the organization?
Yes, okay,
Senior staff, are there key activities listed and do they have calendars? Again, what does that year look like for them?
okay,
Do you have something in place about check signing and payroll responsibilities?
yes, okay,
And have you conducted an inventory of passwords, computer information, where certain keys are for things like maybe a storage building?
okay,
And then the board knows how to access the following. So confidential information such as personnel files,
yes, okay,
corporate records,
okay,
and are the executives' files organized and properly labeled?
okay, okay,
Is the board aware of their skills? So what skills they have on the board, what skills they don't, what they can do?
okay,
Is the board engaged and understand any kind of issues within the organization?
okay,
Do they provide an evaluation for you annually?
okay,
Do they conduct a board self-evaluation?
okay,
So here's the result. So are you ready? So if you've got a 31 to 40, once you total up your scores, I'll let you do that. I'm excited to hear what your score is.
okay. Okay, looks like it's 29.
Okay. So that's in the uh-oh range.
Yeah.
So, but this, and I will send this readiness checklist out to you.
Okay,
In addition to the slides, so you'll have that. It's certainly something that you can work on your board with if you'd like to. But it'll give you an idea of some of the things that you should think about putting in place in order to prepare your succession plan. So any question about any of those things?
no, that was good.
Okay, good. All right, let's talk a little bit about developing the succession plan. So here are some of the elements of the succession plan. And one of those things is kind of the assumption that the new chief executive can take the organization to its expected level of performance. So it's important, and I talked about a little bit earlier about when you get ready to hire an organization, gets ready to hire a new executive director, or even bringing a new board chair on, that it's important for them to look at some of the gaps for that might exist within the organization, some of the growth that they might want the organization to have after the executive leaves. So sometimes, and I don't know how long have you been in your role, Meredith?
Executive director since 2015.
Okay, so that's when I became executive director here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber. So anyways, that's that's important for them to look at.
Mhm.
What next level does that organization want to move to, and making sure that they they identify what they're going to be looking for in a new chief executive. Certainly the processes for hiring a new chief executive. So what is it? What does that look like? It seems like every organization has a different process for hiring a new chief executive. And some of them, they want the whole board to participate in that process. Some just want, the exec committee to participate. Some want the executive committee, so the chair, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer, and a couple of community members or a couple of stakeholders. So whatever that process is, and how many people are they going to choose as finalists? How many people are they going to actually interview? Are they going to conduct phone interviews before they do in-person interviews? So what does that process look like from beginning to end? And one of the things I've seen with organizations that don't have succession plans in place is they're fumbling around to try to figure out how to do all that stuff, and it can take them 5-6 months to replace the executive. And that's a long time for an organization to be without a chief executive. Certainly, one of those elements is planning for managing the executive transition period. So how is the work going to be done during the time there is no executive? Is the executive going to hang out until a new executive is hired and train that new executive? Whatever that looks like, how are things going to be done within the organization? Who's going to do what during the time that there potentially is no executive? Because certainly somebody has to pick up those duties, right? Maybe identifying who's, somebody's going to serve it as an interim. And is that going to be somebody internally? Is that going to be somebody that serves on the board? Some organizations have the board chair serving as the interim ED, which terrifies some board chairs I know that I've spoken with, like, how am I going to take on all of that? So looking again, planning for the executive transition period. And then emergency measures for unexpected loss of the chief executive, that certainly needs to be an element in your succession plan. So, most organizations that I talk to or that I work with here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, I can tell you that they are a long way from being prepared if suddenly they lose their executive director. And I know there was an organization here that a nice size organization here that dealt with homelessness, that their executive director had a heart attack in the night. She was found deceased at her home, and they were not ready for how are they going to continue to run that organization during that time. And again, we keep a lot of tribal knowledge as executives that we don't, we just don't really think about sharing with other people.
Right.
So if suddenly we haven't captured that and nobody knows, it's just important to make sure that some of those things are in place in case of that unexpected loss. And then making sure that you're keeping the board undivided and focused on the future. Certainly, this is not a time to have division amongst board members on how things should be operated, how they should function during that transition. So certainly capturing that in the succession plan, how they're all going to work together is important as well. So we're going to look at the succession policy plan, the emergency succession plan, doing an organizational inventory, and the leadership development plan. So certainly these are all things that are important to have in place as you work on your succession, developing that succession. So other elements of the succession policy plan is that statement of commitment to prepare for inevitable leadership change. So the board needs to commit to knowing that at some point in time in the future of the organization, they are going to have that change. So they need to not be in denial about the fact that will happen at some point in time. We don't live forever. We don't stay, as much as I love the work that I do, I will not be here forever and ever. Someday I'll be gone. So they need to be, they need to have that statement of commitment that they're going to prepare. for what's inevitable in the future.
Well, and I see a lot of this uh helpful not only at the staff level, but also at our board level,
Yes.
because we are in the process where we've got a board member who's terming out. And so
Yep.
I've got to have a transition where I have another board member who's ready to step into the chair, the role of
Yes.
chair. And
Yeah.
so that's something that I have to think through. I have somebody in mind and this person knows it, but I haven't done any sort of work with them or the board to, put it out there and say, okay, at the end of this year at our annual
Sure.
meeting, this is going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important. It's important for everybody to accept that leadership change is going to happen. And you're right. It happens on the board as well. And much of this is applicable to both. I mean, this is about ED and board chair succession. So you're right. It's applicable to both. Certainly that statement of commitment to assess leadership needs before beginning a search. So really identifying what they need in a leader, because again, and I talk sometimes about an organization that I was involved with that had a wonderful executive that led the organization for many years, did a lot with the organization, but the organization really was ready for some changes, some different growth. So assessing what kind of skills then do we need to look for in the next executive that weren't identical to the last executive, because we needed a different skill set. We needed somebody that the former executive director was great at managing the organization, growing the organization, building some donor relationships, but we needed somebody that could build stronger donor relationships, build relationships with more donors. So we just needed a different skill set. So it's important to commit that that you're willing to assess that and identify what skills are needed. Certainly a plan to appoint an interim leadership to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So that needs to be part of that policy and plan. And what does that look like? Again, I don't think ideally, whether, if you're replacing your executive temporarily with the board chair, that's always the ideal situation, even though I know that's what some organizations do, and it's in their bylaws that what their board chair would do in case of loss of the executive. But I think having somebody in place that can take over things besides that board chair is really important. So they need to plan for whatever that looks like. And if that's somebody else within the organization, they need to plan for that too. And same with the board chair, especially if you don't have a vice chair in place that's naturally going to roll up and be that board chair. If the board chair suddenly leaves, who's going to play that, role? If you've got a vice chair, that's not a huge issue. But if the vice chair steps up and, they were doing something else and they can no longer handle that role, then who's going to do that? So it's important to identify who's going to serve in the interim. And then it really should consist of an outline of succession procedure. So again, everything that should happen in that succession as that occurs. And I have some documents again that I'll send you that relate to succession planning that I think will be are really good tools, I guess. Other things are outline of succession procedures, which include what's that internal management succession to the interim position. What is the time frame for making the interim appointment? So how quickly is that actually going to happen? Are we ready to do that in a week? Are we ready to do that in 2 weeks? Because leaving that executive role or leaving even the board chair's role vacant for a long period of time is not good. So we need to be prepared to make that interim appointment, that the board needs to identify, how quickly they're going to do that. And then the time frame for appointing a board transition committee. So again, that would be how quickly is the board planning to get together that hiring committee that's going to look at all of this stuff, that's going to look at the current job description, that's going to look at what are the gaps, what's the growth for the future that they want the organization to have, and what kind of skills do they need for that. So what does that time frame look like? And then it also needs to outline the roles of the transition committee. So these are some of the things that the transition committee usually will do: communication with stakeholders. So how they need to be able to identify, how are you going to communicate with those donors? How are you going to communicate with those people that you serve? How are they going to communicate with other leaders in the community, or other partners, or other people that they need to communicate with? Identifying a transition management consultant. So if they're going to hire somebody that's going to do some sort of an external search, some organizations do that, some don't. It really depends on whether they have the funding to do that. But certainly they need to identify how that's going to be done if they're going to do that. And then how to conduct an organizational assessment and designing the search plan. So that's the roles of the transition committee. So they need to be thinking about how they're going to do all that stuff and include that in the succession policy. So for the emergency succession plan, you certainly need to make sure that whatever job description that there is for the executive director, or even for the board chair, that it's current and up to date. That I think organizations should look at that every couple of years. The governance committee should be looking at that anyways, and just making sure that it's still applicable to what an executive is doing these days. Another ideal time to do that is during the evaluation of the executive, and identify, are you still doing this? What else are you doing? Because I certainly know as an executive director that we tend to take on additional responsibilities over time. So who are the logical successors? So in an emergency, who would it make sense that could potentially step into that role? And as well as, who does it make sense back to the interim that could serve as the interim? It should have some priority functions. So looking at cross training within your organization, which should occur long before you ever need an emergency succession plan. There should be something that's developed that allows other people within the organization. And how many staff do you have?
We have 7 full-time and 8 part-time.
So you have the opportunity to potentially cross-train. I know some
Oh, yeah.
organizations, if they've got 1 or 2 people, you
Yeah.
know, you've got an executive and one other person, that's a little bit more difficult to do.
Yeah.
But certainly looking at what are the opportunities to cross-train within an organization. So potentially those duties could be spread across the organization. I know here we're in transition with our program coordinator right now, which is one of our biggest roles here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, because a lot of what we do is training. So not having somebody in place, we're in the process of spreading out those duties until I can hire somebody to do that. But it's important that each of the staff that I have knows how to take on some of these additional things. They know how to work with Constant Contact. They know how to work with our project management software. You know, they know how to do those different things. So certainly having a plan for cross-training is important. That communications plan, again, how is this going to be communicated to the stakeholders and other people within the organization? Even how's it going to be communicated to the staff? And what is the expectation for how staff communicates that to other people that might call and ask, like, what happened to the executive? What's the plans for the future? Anything like that. So putting those things in the succession plan are important. Identifying what are the key relationships and stakeholders for the organization. So who are your primary partners? Who are your biggest donors? Who else, you know, do you need to maintain those relationships, or the organization needs to maintain relationships with during this transition? after suddenly losing an executive. And then having some sort of a calendar in place, again, that ties back to that operation plan. What happens when? You know, when is this big fundraiser or that big fundraiser? When are we supposed to be filing our Kansas annual report? When are we supposed to file our 990? Just having that annual calendar of what should happen kind of when. And even, you know, when do we annually apply for this grant or that grant? Just so that, you know, if that's knowledge that the executive has and a lot of other people don't have that knowledge, having that calendar in place, which is a good practice anyways. And then certainly a part of that emergency succession plan should be an inventory that's conducted. And when I say inventory, I don't mean of every asset that you have within the organization, but inventory in regards to passwords, keys, accounts that you might have, how to, you know, how somebody could potentially get into the bank account. What are the bank account numbers? What kind of insurance policies does the organization have? All those types of things should be a part of that emergency succession plan, certainly. And again, sometimes I know as executives, at least speaking for myself, I don't always think about writing all those things down.
Yeah.
I just know them. That's dangerous. So here's an organizational inventory. Speaking of those things, it should be an organizational inventory. And again, this is a document that I put in here, but that I will send you as well. So you could use this as a template. So what is the name of the bank? Who are the contacts? What are the account numbers? Do you have investments someplace, even if it maybe is in a money market or something like that? Do you have investments? Do you have an attorney? Who is that attorney? Or even if you don't have one, a retainer or something, who have you traditionally worked with?
Yeah.
What are the insurance contacts? Do you have directors and officers insurance? If so, who do you have that with? Do you have health insurance? Who do you have that with? So that's an idea of some of those things.
Okay.
Here's some other things that you could put as part of your organizational inventory. So that IRS determination letter, I can't believe how many times somebody wants that original IRS determination letter. And although you can get a letter from the IRS website, it's not the same one. And some organizations won't take that.
Yeah.
The mission statement, where do you store the board minutes from all the minutes that you've had over the years? And then things like that EIN number and your current and previous 990s, which I don't think is a big deal, because if people know how to access those on the IRS website, well, maybe they just need to know that they're accessible on the IRS website. So this is just a great list to work off.
Yeah. Yeah, that will be
through, you know, and the building management or maintenance, like who comes and does that? If the air conditioner breaks, like who do we have to do that? So lots of times, again, speaking for myself, an executive, I don't always communicate this stuff to everybody because I take care of some of it. So just a good tool. Here's a few more things. And like I said, workers' comp, life insurance, disability. Again, I'll send you this document so you can use it as a working document.
Okay.
I can get down. Okay, so leadership development, the key steps, making sure that you're intentional about thinking about how do you cross train, how do you prepare other people within the organization, how do you prepare the board for this transition that is inevitably going to happen. How do you go about securing the board and the staff commitment to leadership development? Because, you know, the importance is that if you don't train those people to lead in the interim, then you're going to run into some issues. You might consider establishing a task force or use the governance committee to identify how leadership development will happen within your organization and even within the board. Certainly, we can always provide leadership development for the board to prepare them to step up into leadership roles, that board chair role, whatever other role. I also like to tell a story about a time that that I was chair of an organization, and I had just rolled up from vice chair to the chair. And of course, I had to talk to the people on the board and let them know we needed somebody that was willing to step up and serve as vice chair, because that's part of the succession planning for the organization. We've got to have somebody that steps up, and it doesn't make sense to bring somebody new on the board to be the chair. They really need to be somebody that's been involved with the organization. And it's not the executive's role to recruit and orient and all that board members. Is the board's role. So I had to say to this board, look, we need somebody to serve as vice chair here. The people that are sitting around this table are the people that can do that. It has to be one of you. This is all we have. We can't bring somebody new on. And literally nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to take on that role. Somebody did end up committing to take on the vice chair role, which means, eventually when their officer term was up, they would, serve as chair. And I know that's a huge commitment, but we've always got to be planning for how do we develop those people, and how do we get them to step up and take leadership roles. You've got to certainly determine the competencies that are needed. So what is lacking within the organization? If you want potentially a program coordinator to serve in the future, if needed, as the interim, what kind of training do they need? What kind of cross training do they need? What kind of leadership development do they need to be able to take on that role as interim in the future? So you've got to think about, what's needed, what's lacking, and then evaluating the current leadership capacity, or the current leader capacity of the organization and the board as well, in order to identify, what you're going to ask these people to do, or what they need to do. You've got to understand what capacity each person has to even do that work. So sometimes if you've got somebody that's already doing two people's jobs, to ask them to do a third person's job doesn't make sense. They're already struggling to do two people's jobs. So what is that capacity for people to take on those leadership roles? So your leadership talent development plan should have a recruitment plan for the staff and the board. So how are you going to recruit in the future? Having an idea, and certainly for the board, that's extremely important, because we have to always be recruiting, not we, but the board needs to always be recruiting for the future of the board. The organizational professional development plan. So what does professional development look like overall for the organization? Really, if your program coordinator needs to learn more for some reason about doing development because they need to work on increasing sponsorships, then what kind of professional development can the organization provide for them to help that person learn that? But it really is important to create that plan for how do you professionally develop, not only the staff within the organization, but the board. It's also important to create individual plans for staff, and the best time to do that, to identify what development they need, what cross training they might need, again, is when you do those annual evaluations. Same with the executive. The board can certainly look at, what's a plan for the executive to help them with their professional development. And then there's that cross training plan, which again goes back to how do we cross train the different people within the organization, and honestly the different people on the board as well. And I know I'll talk just a brief minute about committees. So lots of times when our organizations form committees, we maybe have anybody that does anything related to finance be on the finance committee, but sometimes it's good for those people in the finance committee to spend a year serving on the development committee or the programming committee or something, so they can learn a little bit more about the organization and the different aspects of the organization. Sometimes the marketing person on your board always serves on the development committee, when maybe it's a good idea for them to spend a year serving on the finance committee so they can learn a little bit more about that. So always thinking about how to cross train and what does that plan look like for cross training within the organization. Conducting an annual bench strength review, which again, looking at all the strengths and weaknesses within the organization and where you can improve. Planned opportunities. So, what are the opportunities within your organization, within the board for mentoring and coaching? And I know one of the things that nonprofit organizations sometimes like to do is, in regards to the mentoring, is assign board buddies with new board members. So that's a way you can develop new board members. Certainly you could have internal coaching of different staff as well. So what are those opportunities? And then with all this, identifying a budget for doing so, because certainly development planning you can find some free things out there, but certainly you've got to assign some sort of a budget, put together some sort of a budget for making those things happen. So annual review and updating of the plan. So annually, and again, lots of times the governance committee, which so many organizations, I'm surprised, don't have a governance committee, and yet their role is so big within the organization. But updating that emergency leadership transition plan. So things change throughout the year. We change passwords. Sometimes we change banks. Sometimes we use a new software or a new project management tool or whatever. So making sure that the updates occur annually on that emergency leadership transition plan. Staff certainly change, board changes as they, board terms in. So making sure that you annually update that emergency leadership transition plan. Annually conduct a performance review of the chief executive. And I don't know whether you get an annual review, but I hear a whole lot of nonprofit organizations, EDs, that say, I've never had a performance evaluation. And I preach that to boards on an ongoing basis to make sure they conduct that performance review. It really lets them see where the potential gaps might be. What strengths the ED has, what board development, what development they may need to have, as well as, what they might need in strengths and skills from the future ED. So reviewing that, doing that review annually is really important. Assessing the chief executive against mutually agreed upon goals and expectations. So it's good every year as they do that evaluation, of course, to make sure that they're setting goals with the executive, with you, and to make sure that you're measuring their performance against whatever those agreed upon goals are. They should be doing that on an annual basis, and then implementing a process for reviewing the compensation of the chief executive. I can't tell you again how many boards that I talk to, they call, some board chair calls me and says, we haven't given our executive a raise for many, many years. I don't even know, what to look at. I don't know if we're being competitive or not. And that's especially important these days because things have changed so much with the workforce that for-profit organizations are paying more and more, which is making it a little bit more difficult on nonprofits because we're already struggling, many of us, to stay competitive. So certainly having some sort of process that annually they review that compensation. And that's important for the succession planning because they need to have an idea if they have to replace the executive, will they be able to offer a competitive salary for the new executive that they're potentially bringing in? That's been more and more of a challenge for nonprofits. Certainly determining institutional goals and personal goals. So what kind of goals do they have for the organization? What kind of goals do you have for the board? And what kind of goals? I'm surprised too how many nonprofits don't set goals with their executives.
Mhm.
They leave the executive wondering about what they're really supposed to be doing, or
Mhm.
how they're being measured. So that's
Yeah.
really important. Certainly clarifying the expectations between the board and the chief executive, and especially as those relate to the succession plan. And then ensuring the board and chief executive have shared goals and a collective vision. I know that sometimes when we do strategic planning, more and more often, as I do strategic planning, I see organizations working on a 1-year strategic plan. Our world is crazy. It's constantly changing, but not really having good discussions about the expectations on how the organization should evolve or grow in 3 to 5 years. So
Mhm.
it's great to think about what we're going to do in the next year. The board needs to be thinking about, where we want to be in 5 years.
Mhm.
Otherwise, sometimes we just get caught up on doing our missions and don't ever think about the bigger vision for the organization and what other things that we need to be doing. So
Yeah.
making sure that that's in place. And of course, you've got to be thinking again about where you want that organization to grow as you're looking at hiring potentially a new executive. It's important annually to discuss the chief executive's future plans. So are they planning on staying around another year? Have they thought, about retiring in a few years? Just having some sort of a discussion, checking in with, where the executive director's at. And certainly as an executive director gets closer and closer, I guess, to potential retirement age, continuing to have those discussions. So they have an idea of what the plans are. And I know with you, Meredith, when you mentioned, well, you're going to do this capital campaign, and I assuming you've told the board that after you're done with the capital campaign, you're done.
I haven't yet. That was one of my
Okay.
questions is, when's a good time for me to plant the seed?
Yeah.
Because we're just getting started. So, this is going to be through 2025.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, a couple of years before you're thinking, you're pretty sure that you're going to
Okay.
leave, just kind of giving them a heads up so they
Okay.
know, they're aware, they'll plan for,
Mhm.
hopefully they'll plan for.
Yeah.
Sometimes we struggle to keep our boards on track, but
Yeah.
hopefully they'll plan for that. So again, reviewing and updating the chief executive job description. We've talked about that. Reviewing that succession plan and determining, are there updates need to be made? Does something need to be tweaked? The governance committee, if they can review that every year and identify changes that need to be made. It's better to keep that succession plan up to date by reviewing it every year than to creating one and 10 years down the road decide, because a lot of changes can happen in 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Certainly conducting a board of self-assessment. So that kind of gives the organization an idea of where that board is at, how they're operating, whether or not, board members are attending. Are they thinking about, renewing terms? Are they functioning well? Those types of things. And then identifying the board's strengths and needs, as well as for cross-training. So it's important to define the goals that the board is responsible for implementing. So when we create strategic plans, that should always be done with the board and the executive. And sometimes they, other staff participate in that. Sometimes you have stakeholders participate in that. But it's important to every year define the, what the board is going to be responsible for implementing in that strategic plan. So all board members are responsible for helping with fundraising in some way. So they understand, for the fundraising initiatives, what are they going to be responsible for implementing? Is it going to be asking for sponsorships? Is it, what, just exactly what are they going to be responsible for? Really determining how well the board is working with the chief executive. So kind of looking at that. Is everything going well? How does the communication work between the executive and the board? Do you have a dozen board members that are sending you emails every day asking you for something? Does communication come through the board chair? Having an idea of how that works. And then determine the actions the board will take to act on the results of the self-assessment. So certainly boards can do self-assessments, they can do individual assessments. It's great to do those. But if they don't use those if they don't actually review them, if they just do them and say, okay, we did them, and they don't review where they need to make changes, those types of things, and it really doesn't help them to improve on strengthening the board or their practices, any of those types of things. So let's talk a little bit about board succession planning. Of course, a lot of what we talked about is applicable both to the board and ED, and some more specifically to the ED. But certainly you're going to want to do kind of the same thing, identify the leadership qualities that you have. I like to use a what's called a board matrix to do a gap analysis for the board and kind of identify, what kind of leadership qualities you have, what kind of skills, strengths, and experience that are currently on your board, and what kind of gaps exist for where you need to recruit from. So if you don't have anybody that has like financial experience, that certainly would be a gap. Or if you don't have anybody with
Do you have a matrix you can share?
I do. I'd love
Great.
to send you a matrix.
Yeah.
I'll make myself a little note
Thank you.
to do that. Certainly with your board officer succession, training the officers for their roles. And I think not only training officers for their roles, but actually educating the board overall for what really the expectation is if they take an officer position. Because I think some of the resistance to taking that leadership role on a board has to do with they really don't understand what's going to be expected of them. So they're afraid to step up. And some think, oh, if I become board chair, I'm going to be spending 20 hours a week on my board chair roles. And there might be some board chairs out there like that. I don't know of any, but certainly that unknown when we all have full plates, it can be really scary. So giving them an idea of what a realistic expectations are, realistic expectations for the time commitment and stuff is important. Also making sure that, board terms exist, that if they're committing, they're not committing to a 20-year term. I know I met with an organization recently. Their board chair has said, I'm done. I've been the board chair for 12 years. I told them I was done. I know we have no board chair. They've just not planned well for succession, but that's a long time for somebody to serve as board chair. And nobody else will step up to do that role. And that's not an uncommon story that I hear for people that reach out to me like, how do I fix this problem? Certainly in letting people know that serving in that officer role really does give them an opportunity to gain more skills for their lives, for their jobs. It helps them to build leadership skills. That's certainly something in the succession plan to make sure that you explain about taking on that role. So officers, really they're board members with extra duties. So this is some of those things that you can potentially include in the succession plan, or really communicate to those board members about the succession. So the board chair is kind of like the chief volunteer officer and role model for the board, and making sure that they develop the board, making sure that everybody's cohesive, that they work together well. They get to deal with things like when a board member doesn't show up for board meetings or is unruly or whatever. They're kind of keeping everything just rolling along and operating well. The vice chair, of course, basically, as you know, fills in when the chair is not able to carry out the duties. And often the succession is that vice chair will roll up and serve as board chair, although that doesn't always happen. But sometimes I've been involved with organizations where there was an issue with the vice chair, and they decided that it was not good for them to roll up and be board chair, they didn't work well with people or whatever. So, yeah. And then, of course, the treasurer keeps the board on top of finances, and the secretary generally takes the minutes. Sometimes a staff person does that. Sometimes the secretary will just help with getting the agenda or sending out reminders or whatever, just depending on the structures. So let's go back to the governance committee in regards to, for your succession plan, how you plan for electing board members and officers. Again, some organizations have just a nominating committee. That's all they focus on. I recommend a governance committee because the governance committee can oversee that succession, that, you know, always having people in the pipeline, that kind of thing. But traditional practices would be that governance committee works on preparing that slate, facilitates the election process. That would be their role. The board then confirms the nominations. So that's not something that's done just by the exec committee. That is a whole board thing. You're not a membership. You're not a membership. What organization did you say you were with?
The Eisenhower Foundation.
Okay, you're a foundation.
Yeah.
You're not a membership organization. Although
Correct.
You may be a member of some organizations. Are you a member of the, what's it called? Foundations of Foundations? What?
No,
like that.
we are a member of the Kansas Nonprofit Association.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it is easier for board members to assess the qualifications of candidates and the needs of the board. So. And then, of course, you already know about board term limits, but that's important to outline in the succession plan as well. They should be tied to performance evaluation or peer approval. I know organizations that just don't believe in having board term limits. And really, back to that, what I mentioned about committees, is that, you know, by changing committees or by having those limits on serving in different roles, you have the opportunity to learn new and different things. And it also gives board members an opportunity to practice different types of leadership skills within the organization. A 2-year term for an officer allows an officer to have an impact by accomplishing a specific agenda. A 1-year term is really, for an officer, is really kind of hard to do that. And I know, depending on the organization, like I served on the board of the local American Marketing Association, which is, you know, everybody's volunteers for that association here locally. And so having somebody to serve as the board chair, they always kind of identified with the board, like, what do we want to achieve this year? And the board chair really wanted to see those things. They wanted to see those things through. So a 1-year term was hard for them to do that. But again, that varies from organization to organization. The board always has an option to re-elect an exceptionally effective leader for consecutive term. Again, I wouldn't recommend that they do that for term after term, but certainly they could decide if they wanted to do that, you know, for a couple of terms, I guess. With the exception of an officer, I don't think an officer should serve more than 1 term. So some of the issues that we deal with are just the lack of candidates. So it's important for the organization to identify, why is there a lack of candidates? And I know I do these nonprofit tips of the day on social media. And recently I listed one about the importance of a board chair rolling over and a new board chair coming on. And somebody said to me, well, what if you just have the same person as board chair year after year because you lack qualified candidates? And I said, that means you're not doing a good job of recruiting board members overall. So that's an organization/board issue. If you don't have qualified candidates to step up and serve as board chair, there's something wrong with the way that you're recruiting. There's something wrong there. You know, you need to address that. which ties kind of into that assessing the recruitment criteria. So what are the expectations? Who are you recruiting from? Are you recruiting strategically? Are you explaining to people well what their roles and responsibilities are? So, what is that criteria? Also, what might lead to lack of candidates? Or it's important to make sure that you recruit board members that have leadership experience. Here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, we're a membership organization, so we have to let members nominate, and they get to vote. But one of the things when people are being nominated is that we ask, and when they fill out their applications after they're nominated, is, are you willing at some point in time to serve in a leadership position? Are you willing at some point in time to serve as the chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer? We want to know that, because if everybody that is elected to this board doesn't want to serve in that role, we're in trouble. Because we have to always have somebody that's willing to step into a leadership role. So I think that's an important question for you to present, or your board to present to potential board members, and find out, are they willing to take on those leadership roles? Certainly provide training and leadership development opportunities for the board, just like you do with your staff, and give them opportunities to learn more about the different roles and, again, what's expected of them. If your organization board members don't know much about finances, certainly reading financial statements for the organization is one of their most important duties, because they're legally and financially responsible for the organization. So have somebody teach them, even if it's the finance chair, have somebody teach them about reading those financial statements. Then maybe they'll be willing to serve on the finance committee. Whatever ways you can find to provide leadership development for them as well. And then encourage board members to serve as a committee chair. That's an opportunity for them to kind of get their feet wet in somewhat of a leadership role, and learn about taking on that leadership, as well as, learning about how different committees function, but it gives them opportunity to lead. Some immediate solutions also to deal with that is making sure that you're analyzing the job descriptions and the expectations of board members. So every board should have a description and some sort of a board member agreement that outlines what their roles and responsibilities are. So that can be discussed with them up front, so there's no surprises. You can certainly look at dividing responsibilities, such as creating a co-chair position. I've seen that with organizations as well, that instead of just having a chair, they'll have co-chairs. They'll have two people, and they feel like in this day and age, with everything that's going on, that they can be a co-chair. Identify if long-term commitment is too demanding. This goes back to that those organizations either don't have board terms, or that they have those board terms where you can serve for 20 years, whatever. I see that it's a lot to ask somebody to commit to, and it contributes to burnout. So, really kind of looking at what that commitment is. Shorten the board or officer terms. You can certainly do that as well. Average these days is 2 or 3 years for a board term. Generally repeatable 2 or 3 times. Average this year for officer term is generally 1 to 2 years. I see more 2 years, but certainly assessing that. And only ask, as a last resort, should you ask a board member or officer to extend a term by a year. Again, you have to remember burnout and the other things that happen. And make sure that if you're making these changes, that you certainly change the bylaws as needed as well. So make sure you're always in compliance with your bylaws. So removal of officers, of course, that process should be spelled out within your bylaws. And here's a few reasons that, removal is absolutely necessary when there's some sort of a major disagreement that just absolutely can't be resolved. It's okay for board members to speak up. Certainly they should speak up, and they should talk about their concerns, but you also don't want huge major disagreements or board splits to occur. certainly when a board member is not coming to board meetings, not fulfilling their board requirements, or there's inappropriate behavior of a board member. So in your leadership development for your board, make sure you have put together a board recruitment plan. So don't just leave that to chance. And don't forget that recruiting from committee members that aren't part of your board, but are just serving on the committee, great pipeline for bringing new board members on place. So, but having that board recruitment plan, certainly doing a self-assessment, conducting that board profile, which again, when I send you that matrix, you'll have that. Looking at self-selection, so making sure that you know, sometimes you have board members that want to self-select to serve in particular roles, and having conversations with them about that. Certainly providing development for the chair-elect, so they know when they roll up as chair, what that is going to look like for them, what kind of things do they need to learn about. And I think, you know, kind of working really closely with the current chair is certainly good practice for them. And then what kind of mentoring can you potentially provide? And I think I mentioned earlier about the board buddy, potentially developing a board buddy program. So just back to the strategy, the overall succession planning. I feel it's important to always have a plan to ignore. I love this. It's important that when we create these plans, that we don't just create them, put them away, and as I mentioned earlier, come back 10 years and check them out again and see if they're very relevant. We really need to pay attention to these plans. That's all I have. Do you have any questions or anything that I can answer for you or comment?
No, I would be interested in, again, the board matrix.
Yep.
And then also the operations inventory
Yes,
checklist. That would be very helpful.
I will get that to you as well.
Okay, great.
Well,
Well,
thank you very much.
thank you. I didn't know I was going to be the only one
I
today.
know. Well, and the thing is, I'm instructed that even if there was a couple of people registered, but even if nobody shows up, I do the recordings.
Yeah.
And that way I can provide them so people can go back and review. So you'll get everything that I sent ahead of time, plus the PowerPoint templates and the other things that I promised to send you.
Oh, great. Yeah.
But it was certainly a pleasure to meet you and provide some training today. So when I send out the documents for you, you'll certainly have that information. If there's anything else that I can help you with here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, certainly let me know.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.